Hi. We continue today in Genesis 8 with this poignant phrase, God remembered Noah. And you can see in the chart on the right side where I've been following three various ways to structure this set of chapters. The chiastic structure that we've been following in the blue there has 8.1a, just that short phrase at the very center of the chiasm, and then the flood begins to recede and creation begins anew. This is one of three ways we've had to be looking at it. In the Wenham version, you can see that there are a pair of E sections at the center, and so our section today, 8.1 to 5, is the second half of the matching. He has it rising waters and falling waters without the separate thing of God remembered. And in Kasuto's two sets of six paragraph version, he has 8.1 to 14 as the entire end of the flood. That doesn't matter so much for our purpose, although what is interesting for our purpose today is that as we look at 8.1 to 5, as you can see as the F1 part on my chiastic structure, some of what we see there will actually echo the E part earlier, 7:11 to 16, as we'll see. And that's one issue to be considered. But the other issue has to do with what we've been following in terms of the sources. So we've been looking at this chart here. Here's the front of it. There's a traditional separation of Genesis 6 to 9 into J, or as it's called sometimes now by scholars, non-P version and the P version. But when we get to 8.1 to 5, this is understood as the P version, even though I'll show you there's a part of a verse here which certainly seems to echo the J version. But we're not going to focus on that today because that's not really the theme that we're going to be looking at. We're going to focus on God's remembering, on this recreation that happens here, and on the curious history of Mount Ararat after Genesis. So we've been looking at the echoes of Genesis 1 and the flood, and I really want to focus here on not just 8.1, as you can see there at the center of the screen, and God made the wind blow over the earth, the second part of verse 8, as you can see on the left side, but how this follows throughout the rest of chapter 8 and chapter 9 as echoing Genesis 1 and 2. So starting with this separating the waters into water and dry land, the call to be fruitful and multiply on the earth, the call for the waters to bring forth swarms of creatures, the blessing of humanity to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, the giving of food, and the recitation that humans have been made in God's own image. And this is the kind of thing that leads Theodore Hebert, as we looked at the beginning of this series, this section where we did an overview of the whole flood, to suggest that Genesis, although traditionally divided into primeval history, chapters 1 to 11, then beginning with chapter 12 with the family stories, really ought to be divided here of before the flood and after the flood, because after this recreation, the terms of God's relationship with humanity and creation maintain themselves. They're not changed. There's another covenant, as we know in chapter 17 with Abraham, but the terms of relationship aren't changed, as we'll see here in chapter 9, very different in this recreation story than the original terms in chapter 1 and 2. So that's a theme we want to be looking at here. And we're also focusing a little bit on how unique words are in the flood story, and a lot of that has to do with how it's shaped poetically, as we'll look at in a second. I've actually updated this chart from one that I'd posted on the webpage, and I'll post the newer version here, because I found an extra word here that I hadn't seen. The word shook there for abate or decrease was not in my original version. So if you downloaded that one earlier now, there's going to be an upgraded one by the time you're watching this. So, as we showed last time in 7:17 to 21, I looked at what happens if you shape these verses poetically in the traditional Hebrew way, where there's a pair of lines and the second one intensifies the first one, but they're more or less saying the same thing. Or it uses, as we've seen throughout this section, unusual words, poetic words. So let's look at it this way when we listen to the first verses, divided up as you can see here on the screen. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the water subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heaven was restrained, and the waters gradually receded or returned from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. So just as we saw the steady process of the water rising using different words for increase and swelling, here we see different words for the water decreasing. And in the Hebrew, we can really see that even if we don't look at the specific words. I just want to use Bible Hub here to scroll through it so you can look at both the number sections, which are the strong numbers, which indicate a unique Hebrew word, and then the orange translation that they provide. So we can see all the words that are for undoing the increase of the waters in these verses. So we see that God remembered, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And then we see here subsided, and that's number 79:18. We see we're stopped here, number 55:33. We see restrained 3607. We see receded 7725. We see decreased 2637. We see going back 1980. And then finally receded again in the last verse here, decreasing here, 2637. So a whole series of words, and not all of those are unique to the flood, but highlighting that the authors are taking as much care to show the water coming down as they did the water coming up in this poetic redoing of creation here with the water separating from the land. And it starts here with God remembered. This is the first time that the word zakar, the Hebrew for remembered, is in the Bible, and if we're reading it sequentially, first time in Genesis, but 235 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, and as you can see from my notes, several times for later in Genesis. But I'd like to look at a classic example so we can see the contrast with what the authors of Genesis are showing us here about God's remembering and what we see in the classic story from Exodus. So if you're not familiar with the basic Exodus story, the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt, and Moses is the prince of Egypt, but then he's under the witness protection program for having been seen killing an Egyptian, and he goes off and hires himself out to work for a shepherd. And he has his burning bush experience, and that happens in the verses right after we're going to look at here. So in between that, we see this from the last two verses of chapter 2 of Exodus. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in that situation, and similarly in Genesis 19, one of the other uses of remembered, there's a cry, there's an outcry that people are drawing God's attention to their situation, and usually that means a situation of social injustice, as in Egypt or in Sodom. But there's no cry here. There's just the people on the ark, and they're locked in, and so there's no particular impetus, that's certainly not caused by humans, for this act of remembering. And yet there it is. As my note down below shows, Wenham notes that the word here suggests not so much remembering as recall, but more equivalent to think about. Like as if you say, I remember I have to do this later today. You're bringing to mind something you have to do, not remembering an event from the past. So one could say that God called to mind Noah and the wild animals and domestic animals. But what about before this? Had God forgotten? There's no contrasting word here to suggest not thinking about or what was God doing while the water was rising. As some scholars have noted, the way the waters rise suggests a natural phenomenon, although it's obviously being caused by God, as we saw in chapter 6, where it's very explicit that God is causing this flood. But what it is that's causing God to remember, or what God was doing in God's own mind, so to speak, before this moment isn't clear. And it's rather startling. It suggests that sometimes God thinks about humans and sometimes God doesn't. Certainly in the verb form we have here, it's an event of something happening, not a naming of God's continuous reality. That God is always alert for humans, and we could find passages about that, especially in poetic things like Psalms, where God is always attending to creation, always attending to humanity. As some of the Midrash has said, if God stopped attending to humanity or creation for 1 second, creation would just simply disappear. And maybe that's all so, and I'm not asking the existential question about what's really true, quote unquote, about God and the universe, but simply the literary question about what the Genesis authors are suggesting here by this injecting this act of remembering at the very center of the chiastic shape of this flood story. We can't know what they were thinking, but it certainly does suggest that it's something that God does sometimes and not other times, and we'll see more of that as we go through. So it also is suggesting a change of mood here. It's not like metanoia in the Greek or shub, return in Hebrew, although we're going to see the word return, not for somebody returning God, but the waters returning to their proper place. And perhaps there's a word play in there for alert Hebrew listeners. But here is the focus on the recreation, on the relenting of the destruction. And as one of our authors said earlier, the first half, if we will, is the justice half, and the second half is the mercy or compassion half. So God remembers Noah and all the wild animals, the domestic animals, curiously not naming the creeping things or the birds, but presumably this includes all of them. There's no sense that they're not being included here. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the water subsided. And this is very clearly echoing Genesis 1. You see that very almost identical phrase from Genesis 1:2 of the Ruach, Elohim, over the Ha'eretz. and the water subsided, and we get the first of our many words here. And it's up again, like the water going up, it's a process. Some scholars have noted that in some of the parallel Mesopotamian stories, given the importance of the sun in the desert climate there, whether that would be true for Egypt, where the sun god is Ra, or in the Mesopotamian world, there's nothing here that says the sun is drying this out. It's not like the clouds dissipated and the sun came out and it all dried up. It's the wind that's doing it. There's no mention of the sun at all. And as you saw in Genesis 1, the Genesis authors, in this case almost certainly the P author, are making a point of highlighting not a divinity element to the elements, to the objects in the sky. There's no moon goddess, there's no sun god. These are simply night lights and daylights, as we saw in Genesis 1. So they're making a cautious effort to keep the sun out of the intention of the process of how this is drying out. So it's simply this wind from God. And then this is one of the elements that echoes 7:11, which is chiastically not exactly parallel here, but there it is anyway. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven, which were opened in 7:11, are now closed. And again, reminding us the deep here is Tehom, which is echoing Tiamat, the Babylonian ocean goddess from Enuma Elish, not from Gilgamesh or the other flood stories, but from the primeval creation stories. And the windows of the heavens are closed, and that takes us out of the P thing, but rain, we saw earlier, some J, and although my note below says J statement of the flood, that's in contrast with many scholars seeing 8:1-5 as all P. Again, we're not going to worry about that. Any reader here has no problem with the consistency here, with fountains of the deep closing, the windows of the sky closing, and the rain was restrained, and the waters gradually receded from the earth. And the adverb here modifies this, is only found in a couple of places, and as Casuto notes, or perhaps he's trying to rationalize to make sense of this out of one continuous text rather than two separate authors, that the onset of the waters is sudden and powerful, but the recession is slow and steady. In other words, it takes it longer for them to dry out, and hence, at the end of the 150 days here, the water had abated, although literally it's cut off here. And it's very misleading, because in the New RSV it has abated in verse 3 and then has continued to abate in verse 5, and they're not the same word in Hebrew. And we're not going to worry about that, because the nuances of these words are not that different. I've already shown you the range of the Hebrew words there, and they're poetically unusual words anyway. But hopefully, collectively, you can get the sense of the steady slowing down of the waters and the receding, and in a moment land will appear. And just as the flood began with a specific timing of the date, here it's coming to an end with the specific timing. On the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest. And then we have a phrase that's caused an enormous amount of trouble for no reason other than people's fear of the Bible being something other than what they were taught it was. And so let's look closely here. The phrase mountains of Ararat. And if we look at it here in the Hebrew on the right side of the screen, you can see here, Hare Ararat, mountains of Ararat. In other words, it's not Mount Ararat. There was nothing known in the Bible as Mount Ararat. Ararat is known as a country, and the country it's known as later is Armenia. Both the Septuagint translates as Armenia, and the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible created by Jerome in the 4th century of the Common Era, also renders this as Armenia. And that's so powerful that the Armenian culture has adopted this story as part of their national story and has named a mountain Mount Ararat, even though it hadn't otherwise previously been called that. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But staying with the Bible's element of this, the biblical aspect is there's a region called Ararat. It's only referred to as a couple of times. It's not an important place in the Bible, and it has mountains. And so just as in the flood rising, the waters covered the mountains, now the mountain tops are exposed and the ark is stranded there. That doesn't mean the waters have completely gone down. You can see on the screen in verse 5 that waters continued to abate until the 10th month, so 3 more months, but it was enough down that it could be stranded on the mountaintop. And that little verse has led almost exclusively evangelical Christians, not mainline Christians or Catholic Church involved in this, and certainly not the Jews whose texts these originally are and continue to be, to try to make this a literal statement of Mount Ararat because of their deep and abiding anxious fear that if the Bible's not literally true, then it's not true at all. And so we've seen many times, whether it's about the ark itself or about creation in the Garden of Eden story, here this is being taken that way too. And it's one of those odd examples of life imitating art, imitating life here, because to the extent that the flood story is based on the Genesis author's experience of the Mesopotamian flood stories, justifying the Mesopotamian culture, and later Christian readers are reading the Genesis story to justify their Christian understanding of God in charge of the world, then we have the people of Armenia making it taking that to make it their place, even though it's not officially. At least not officially, it wasn't originally. It is officially now Mount Ararat, but it wasn't originally that. Here's an image of it, and if you went to the Wikipedia page, which is actually very helpful and has a couple hundred footnotes, unlike some Wikipedia pages, it's very helpful to trace in much more detail than I want to here of how, starting in the 4th century, Christian writers began to associate a specific mountain with the resting place of the Ark, and how that continued, establishing Mount Ararat as a name in the 11th century, and then having climbs to the top of it in the medieval era, then prohibiting climbs because it was considered too sacred a place because of its association with this story. You know, it's not a sacred place because the people of Armenia experienced something sacred there. It's simply sacred because of a misreading of the meaning of Genesis 8:4 here. And just to show you how that plays in the relatively recent modern world, here's the poster from the film In Search of Noah's Ark. And I want to show just a few seconds clip of this so you can see the kinds of questions that this documentary makers are making, highlighting such a different way to approach the text than what we're doing here.
There is a mountain in eastern Turkey known as Mount Ararat. It's a beautiful mountain, towering 17,000 feet above the Turkish frontier. It is also the mountain believed by many to hold one of mankind's greatest mysteries. For ever since man first began to write, it has been written that Mount Ararat was the landing place of Noah's Ark. The motion picture you are about to see will attempt to unravel this 5,000-year-old mystery. We'll try to determine if the story of Noah is true, and if the Ark, in fact, does rest on the slopes of Mount Ararat.
So you can watch that entire video on YouTube. You can just take a click away from watching this video, and you can watch the whole thing if you like. And so we reach the end of our scene here in verse 5. The water continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains appeared. That appears to be out of context because apparently the ark came to rest on it. But of course, the ark could come to rest on it even if the top of the mountain hadn't been exposed, because the ark is tall enough that the bottom of it could get stuck there. So there's nothing inconsistent with that at all, as we see it stopped at the top of the mountains. And that's where we'll pick it up next time with the end of 40 days. See you then. Bye-bye.